A first-person shooter, or FPS game, is a video game with the camera displaying the character's perspective, and in which the objective involves eliminating a non-playable character and/or another player with a gun or other type of ranged weapon. Definition courtesy of me. Now, FPSs have become a staple in the gaming community, and is now one of the biggest types of games that are out there on the market today. Recent estimates show an average concurrent player count of all combined FPS games to be at least 3, maybe even 4. So, how did such a mindless and seemingly unsavory concept take over gaming and become so popular? Well, to answer that question, we need to take a look back in history. History? Yes, I said it. Let's take a trip down memory lane and take a look at the methodical and evolutionary development of this genre. So who came up with the idea of running around and shooting each other? Why are we here where we are today? What is the meaning of life? Well, the guy that came up with this idea was probably the guy that came up with the first SPS game, and his name is... Now,
Steve
if you were like me 5 weeks ago, you might say something like, the first game ever made was Doom. The game that can run on a TI-84 calculator? I'm not kidding, by the way, in case you hadn't heard. Take a look for yourself. Yeah, that wasn't the first one. It was actually a game called Maze War. Now, Maze War is about as simple as a first-person shooter you can possibly get, especially considering that it was the first one ever made. You play as an eyeball that can move, turn, and shoot other players who are also eyeballs. While most FPS games that we think about today are fully online, Maze War was only able to be played by physically connecting devices with a cable. Now, Maze War wouldn't really be considered anything revolutionary. It wasn't the first game put on a screen, and it wasn't the first time someone thought about projecting a 3D image onto a 2D plane. It simply took multiple things, combined them, and then added pew pew because someone thought that'd be fun, and they were right. But why shooting specifically? What if the idea had never come about and it was some other objective, like literally anything else, but other than shooting each other? Well, guess what? It was inevitable. To be honest, gameplay that revolves around eliminating other players is something we simply enjoy. Take dodgeball, for example, where you throw a ball at another player in order for them to be eliminated and not have any more impact in play, or less impact depending on the version of dodgeball. Dodgeball never had the connotation of being violent or brainless, instead being seen as skillful and competitive. Even some versions of tag revolve around eliminating players through a different medium, different rules. If war wasn't about killing and maiming people, it might even be fun. Even we have games revolving around war, like chess. The only difference is that games allow for the fun of fighting without the risk of hurting people, because that's what a game is. Which leads us back to shooting. The reason we have guns in games is because it allows us to easily incorporate the elimination style gameplay with something analogous to real life, something that makes logical sense. If you want to eliminate a player from a distance, guns are just the most logical thing to code. Okay, so back to Doom. It was a very early first-person shooter, but not the first one by a long shot. It was counter-revolutionary, you could say, because it took what was available, that being the FPS games of the time, as well as its predecessor Wolfenstein, and expanded and improved upon it all to make something completely new. It completely overhauled things like graphics, while also introducing things like allowing for custom map making. I guess you can challenge the use of the word revolutionary, considering the fact that you would use the same word for Maze War, which introduced the entire concept of a shooting game, with Doom simply building on it. However, it was a gateway to the progression of the FPS franchise, apart from being incredibly popular, and the best for its time. Also, don't forget about how many games during this era, or at least after Doom, had many similar elements that wouldn't have been present if it weren't for this game. I mean, it literally broke the genre wide open and redirected its development indefinitely. It also literally broke the servers because of how many people tried to download it at once. Enter one of the most iconic games of all time, Counter-Strike. Now, I say game, but really Counter-Strike became a franchise of its own, just like every popular game, including the aforementioned Doom. It started with some college students after the FPS genre had already been well established. First came the original Counter-Strike, which is known today as CS 1.6. Then Valve tried to release an Xbox version, but it just wasn't as good as the other shooter games available on the console, so nobody really paid any attention to it. After that came a small little iteration called Counter-Strike Condition Zero. It was basically like 1.6, except with graphics overhauls and not much change to gameplay itself. After that, however, came a large iteration called Counter-Strike Source. This did overhaul gameplay and played completely differently to 1.6, which created, quote, a civil war in the Counter-Strike community over which game was better, the original 1.6 or Source. After that came a little iteration that was actually the biggest iteration yet, called Counter-Strike Global Offensive, or CSGO, and that overhauled both graphics and gameplay again. It took people a while to get used to since it was completely different from either of the two biggest games so far. After that came a lot of iterations, not through another game, but through changing CSGO itself. Valve learned a valuable lesson from that, and in the most recent installment, CS2 only really overhauled graphics and bug fixes, instead of throwing in an actual new game to learn and for nobody to enjoy. I hope that you see then, that Counter-Strike has had its own little independent system of iteration and improvement over the decades, just like the entire genre does on a large scale between franchises. So instead of mindless shooting games, it's more just a straightforward pattern of gameplay that takes many forms and changes based on previous versions' successes and failures. Everything does this, from literature to music to movies and TV shows. I'm pretty sure that Charles Darwin had something to say about this style of change, but I don't know, I'm not a biology expert. I don't mean to be the weird nerd apologist that thinks video games are cooler and more, quote, academic than they are, but I'm just here to point out that it's not the opposite thing either. Anyway, YouTube penalizes me for poor video engagement, so I think that having a proper outro isn't a good idea. Anyways, the end of the video. Bye.